I've always loved the morning hours. It was my time when I could disconnect from everything and simply enjoy the moment. The empty beach, gently embraced by the mist of the dawn, remained almost the same as it had many years ago when Matt and I had just started dating. Every day, I would walk our dog, Lulu, and breathe in the salty sea air, which awakened a forgotten sense of calm within me. Lately, however, that feeling of peace had started to slip away. I found myself thinking about Matt more often, who had changed in recent months. He would come home late, as if trapped in a maze of work meetings and projects. There was something new on his face, a weariness mixed with a detachment that couldn't be explained solely by the demands of his job. We hardly spoke anymore, as if an invisible wall had formed between us. But maybe I was just imagining things. I'm probably just being overly sensitive, I kept telling myself, hoping that was the case. These thoughts weighed on me as I stood at the water's edge, watching the play of the waves. Lulu was happily darting across the sand, trying to catch every small shell brought in by the tide. Her carefree spirit slightly eased my anxieties. It's just stress. There's a lot of work right now. Everything will get better, I whispered to myself, while a sense of unease grew deep inside, like an elusive shadow. That morning, Matt left for work earlier than usual. His goodbye kiss was the same as always, but I felt a chill. He didn't even look me in the eye. It was a small thing, seemingly, but it hurt deep inside. I stroked Lulu's head and sighed. I need to focus on something else, I told myself, deciding that I would go to the yoga class at the center, where a friend had been inviting me for a long time. A few days later, I decided to clean out the car. It seemed that small items, which accumulate there over weeks and months, have a way of appearing in the most unexpected places. Under the seat, in the door pockets, even between the seats where my hand could barely reach. Lulu was peacefully sleeping on the back seat while I sorted through old receipts, invoices, maps, and brochures. Then I noticed a receipt that stood out from the rest because of its newness and expense. It was a bill from a restaurant, the name of which meant nothing to me, but the amount for the dinner was quite impressive. Not Matt's style. He always said that such places had unjustifiably high prices, and more importantly, we had never been there. Maybe it was just a gift from someone? I thought, but a sense of unease crept in. I slipped the receipt into my pocket and continued cleaning, trying not to give it much importance. However, the feeling of anxiety didn't pass. In the evening, when Matt came home, I casually mentioned the receipt, trying to sound as casual as possible. Have you been to La Pietro recently? I found a receipt in the car. I tossed over my shoulder while sorting through the remaining papers. He hesitated before answering, and in the ensuing silence, I thought I could hear the ticking of the clock in the next room. Oh, that was for work, he replied, a bit more quickly than he should have. We had lunch with a client. I completely forgot about that receipt. I looked at him, hoping to see the usual expression of tiredness on his face, but instead I noticed a shadow of tension. He quickly turned away and began rummaging through his bag, as if looking for something important. It was strange, but I decided not to push the conversation further. Maybe he was indeed just tired. The thought that I was simply making problems up seemed quite logical. However, a couple of days later, when I accidentally caught him whispering on the phone in the hallway, a vague doubt turned into real fear. I came closer and saw his face turn pale when he noticed me. He abruptly ended the conversation and shoved his phone into his pocket. Who was that? I asked, trying to hide my growing concern. Work, he said curtly. Sorry, I have to take this. He went into the study, giving me no chance to continue. For a moment, I felt cold, as if from a sudden gust of wind, which reveals an invisible crack running through the very core of our marriage. With each passing day, my conversations with Matt grew shorter and more formal, as if we were both afraid to touch something fragile and painful. He continued coming home late, explaining it with endless meetings and negotiations. I tried to believe him, but with each night that he stayed out late, the feeling of emptiness grew deeper. I was now attending yoga regularly. The classes allowed me to disconnect from our deteriorating relationship for a while and regain some inner balance. It was there that I first met Logan. He was the new instructor at the center, tall, with a gentle smile and a deep voice that soothed and set the right mood. He spoke to the group calmly, without pressure, and it seemed that his presence created a special atmosphere where time slowed down. After one of the classes, I lingered to drink some water and collect myself when Logan approached me. "How are you?" he asked, noticing that I looked a little lost. "If something is bothering you, you can talk about it. I don't just mean yoga, by the way." His eyes were full of genuine concern, and suddenly I felt like I wanted to answer him, to talk about what I had been hiding even from myself. But instead, I just managed to smile and nodded. "I'm fine, thanks. Yoga really helps." "I can see that," he said with a slight smile. "When you first came, your breathing was tense, like you were carrying a weight." He hesitated, as if worried about being tactless. "Now you breathe differently? Deeper." We exchanged a brief look, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Interest, but not in yoga, rather in the person standing in front of me. It was as if his words carried not just the professionalism of an instructor, but something more personal, something that touched me, not just my body or my practice. In the following weeks, Logan and I started talking more. He often ended up nearby after the classes, and our conversations, which began with discussions about poses and breathing techniques, gradually shifted to more personal topics: childhood, hobbies, books. He was a good listener, asking questions without interrupting, and there was always a genuine interest in his voice. I found myself eagerly anticipating these conversations, as if they were my chance to feel alive again. But deep down, I knew that it shouldn't go too far. After all, Matt and I were still married, even though our relationship felt like an old film reel, awkwardly rewound to the middle. However, one evening, after another class, Logan lightly touched my hand as I was leaving. The touch was almost imperceptible, yet it seemed to awaken a hidden spark within me, one I hadn't felt in a long time. I stopped, and our eyes met. For a brief moment that left more questions than answers. With each session, the line between friendship and something deeper became increasingly blurred. I tried to convince myself that my conversations with Logan were just support during a difficult period, but the spark between us grew and became more palpable. I wanted to see him, to hear his voice, and thoughts of him would come to me at the most unexpected times. During breakfast, on walks with Lulu, even while I was talking to Matt. One day, Logan suggested we grab a coffee after class to discuss the philosophy of yoga. I understood that it was just a pretext, but I agreed, as if subconsciously seeking an excuse for myself. We sat in a cozy cafe, its windows overlooking a fog-covered street. Logan spoke about his journey into yoga, about how the practice had helped him overcome personal challenges. His words sounded so sincere that I felt a special connection forming between us. "Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life?" he suddenly asked, and I realized it wasn't just a rhetorical remark. "Yes," I answered almost in a whisper. "Lately, often. Sometimes it feels like I've lost my way and I'm just drifting, hoping that everything will sort itself out." He looked at me intently as if waiting for me to say more, but I fell silent, struggling to manage the emotions that surged within me. There was something more than just friendliness or sympathy in his gaze, and I felt my heart start to beat faster. That moment when his hand lightly touched mine again seemed longer than anything I had experienced in recent months. We often stayed in the cafe after classes, and our conversations grew more personal, more open. He knew I was having difficulties in my marriage, but I never shared the details, as if the unspoken understanding between us made words unnecessary. Logan didn't push, didn't ask intrusive questions, but his presence was that breath of fresh air I had been missing so much. After one of the sessions, we stepped outside, and he suddenly suggested taking a walk along the pier. I agreed, despite the chilly autumn evening. We walked side by side, and I noticed that although he kept a certain distance, there seemed to be an invisible field of attraction between us. We talked about life, about our dreams, about what could have been if not for the circumstances that held us back. "You know I have feelings for you," he said, stopping and looking directly into my eyes. There was no fear or embarrassment in his voice, only a certainty mixed with tenderness. "Logan," I began, but couldn't finish the sentence. A silence hung between us, filled only with the sound of waves crashing against the pier. In that moment, I realized that I could no longer deceive him or myself. We were standing on a thin edge, and I felt that a step forward could become the beginning of an end that I was so afraid to admit. With each passing day, being at home became more difficult. Matt, as before, was immersed in his work. But now I noticed something new in his eyes. A wariness, as if he suspected something but didn't know how to bring it up. Our conversations were formal and empty, as if we both already knew they wouldn't change anything. I spent more and more time at the yoga center, sometimes staying for extra classes. Logan continued to show me signs of attention, and I found myself increasingly confused about my feelings. Every time our eyes met, it felt like I was standing before a choice I couldn't seem to make. On one hand, I knew I had obligations to Matt, that our marriage, though fraying, was still holding together. But on the other hand, with Logan, I felt alive. Truly alive in a way I hadn't for a long time. One evening, after a class, Logan suggested we go for a walk again, but this time he proposed driving out of town, to the lake, to chat in the quiet, away from everyone. There was something in his voice that made me hesitate. I agreed, although a fierce inner struggle was raging inside me. We drove in his car, talking about books and music, and I found myself wishing that this trip would never end. When we reached the lake, it was getting dark, and the dim light of the street lamps reflected on the calm water. We sat on a bench, and Logan told me about his dreams, how he once wanted to move to the mountains, to live in seclusion and do only what truly brought him joy. I listened to him, feeling his words resonate deep within me. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes you need to take a step into the unknown to understand what you truly want." I looked at him and realized he wasn't just talking about himself. It was a moment when I needed to decide. Would I stay on the same path, or would I take a step toward a new life, even if it meant risking everything I had? "Why have you been spending so much time at the yoga center?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but I could see it wasn't easy for him. "Yoga helps me," I replied, trying to speak as nonchalantly as always. "It just relieves stress." "Only yoga?" His voice faltered, and I noticed a shadow of jealousy in his eyes. I didn't know what to say. There were too many thoughts in my head, too many contradictions. He looked at me as if waiting for me to confess, but I remained silent. That silence marked the beginning of a crack that kept growing, tearing us apart. After that conversation with Matt, I felt the tension in the house reach its peak. His questions became more insistent, and he was clearly searching for something between the lines of my answers. He was no longer just tired or distant. Now there was a wariness about him that was hard to ignore. I understood that he suspected something, but I was afraid to find out how close his guesses were to the truth. One evening, as I was getting ready for another yoga class, Matt unexpectedly offered to give me a ride. It was strange, as he rarely offered to drive me, and I usually got there on my own. I noticed the tense notes in his voice, but didn't refuse. On the way, he tried to make small talk, but the conversation didn't flow. It felt like we were both waiting for the silence to become more meaningful. When we arrived at the center, I noticed that he didn't leave right away. His car remained parked by the road, and I could feel his gaze on me as I walked toward the entrance. The class went by in a blur. My attention kept drifting back to the thought that Matt might still be sitting in the car, watching me. After the class, I stepped outside and saw Logan waiting for me near the parking lot, as he had done many times before. We started talking about the session, and I allowed myself to smile, though the internal anxiety hadn't left me. At that moment, I felt a chill run down my neck. I turned and saw Matt's car in the same spot. He had clearly seen everything. I approached Logan, trying to act naturally, but I could sense that something had changed. When I glanced back again, Matt had gotten out of the car and was walking toward us. My heart began to race, as if anticipating an approaching storm. I thought I'd just wait for you, he said, coming closer and directing his gaze at Logan. There was more than just jealousy in his eyes. There was hurt, mixed with the pain he had been trying so hard to hide. Logan gave a slight nod, as if unsure of the appropriate reaction. Matt, however, didn't take his eyes off me, and his voice was quiet but firm. I think we need to talk, Laura. In that moment, it felt as if the ground beneath my feet was slipping away. I was prepared for any outcome, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I knew about my life was about to start unraveling. After the incident in the parking lot, the tension between Matt and me became unbearable. He no longer tried to hide his suspicions. His questions grew more direct, and his looks became more intense. I could see him searching for even the slightest hint of the truth in my answers, a truth he couldn't or didn't want to voice. My attempts to explain or convince him that everything was fine sounded less convincing, even to myself. Meanwhile, Logan didn't back down. He sensed that something was happening and began to express his feelings for me more openly. One evening, after the class ended, he suggested that we escape to the mountains for the weekend. His proposal felt like a call to flee, a chance to leave everything behind and, if only for a while, forget about the problems that had become unbearable. Let's go, he said, his eyes shining with determination. It's just a weekend. We can reset, get away from all this chaos. I remained silent for a long time, trying to make a decision. Going away with Logan would mean taking a step toward something irrevocable, crossing the line I had been balancing on for the past few weeks. But the thought of being able to escape the crushing guilt and constant tension at home for a couple of days was too tempting. I agreed. On Friday, as I was packing my things, Matt watched me with an expression that was hard to describe as merely suspicious. He looked hollow, as if he understood what was happening but no longer knew how to stop it. He didn't ask a single question, though I could sense he wanted to. Logan and I set off early in the morning, and as the city receded behind us, I felt increasingly relieved. It seemed that the farther we drove, the less I was burdened by the pain and contradictions that had haunted me recently. The mountains greeted us with fresh, cool air and endless views that seemed as boundless as my own doubts. But my freedom was short-lived. In the evening, when we arrived at a small resort, I saw several missed calls from Matt on my phone and a message. We need to talk. I know where you are. My heart sank. I realized that Matt wasn't going to sit idly by. He had truly started to act, and now everything was far more serious than I had anticipated. In the morning, when I woke up, the feeling of anxiety was deeply rooted inside me. Logan was calm, as always, but I could sense that the atmosphere had changed. Matt's words in his message felt like a threat. I know where you are. And I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to spiral out of control. We decided to go for a walk along a forest trail, but I couldn't stop thinking about Matt. Logan, noticing that I was distracted, tried to lift my spirits by talking about the places we were passing, but my attention kept slipping away. I kept thinking about what would happen when I returned home. Halfway back to the resort, my phone rang. It was Matt. I froze as if turned to stone and answered the call. Laura, we need to talk. I'm here, he said, his voice cold as steel. I've come to the mountains. Where are you? I stood there, stunned, unable to believe he had actually followed me. Logan noticed that I was hiding something and stepped closer, watching my reaction intently. I didn't know what to say, but the thought crossed my mind that there was no turning back now. I'm at the resort, I said quietly, realizing I had no other choice. I'll be there soon. When we returned, Matt was already waiting for us at the entrance to the cabin. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were full of hurt and disappointment. I walked closer, feeling the tension build with every step until we were face to face. What does all of this mean, Laura? He began, his voice steady, though I could hear how hard he was trying to keep his composure. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Logan stood off to the side, but his presence seemed to weigh on both of us. I didn't know what to say. Logan tried to intervene, but Matt turned to him sharply. This is between me and Laura. You have no place here. Matt, please, let's talk calmly. I tried, knowing that this could easily turn into an even bigger drama. Calmly? He scoffed, but there was no joy in his smile. You're lying to me, spending time with this man, and you want me to stay calm? The words came out with difficulty, but I could no longer deny the obvious. Yes, I've been spending time with Logan. Yes, I have feelings for him, I finally said, feeling as if the world around me was collapsing. Those words seemed to shatter the silence around us. Without waiting for any further explanations, Matt turned and headed to his car, his steps quick and determined. He didn't look back or give me a chance to say anything else. Logan tried to comfort me, but I pulled away. All I felt in that moment was emptiness and the cold terror of realizing that I had destroyed my own life. Matt moved out of the house a few days after that conversation in the mountains. He packed his things silently, without any extra words, his face an expression of emptiness. When I tried to speak, to explain that it wasn't all so straightforward, he simply replied, "Not now, Laura. Everything has already been said." His calmness was even more frightening than anger. It seemed that he had completely resigned himself to what had happened and was just trying to get out of the situation as quickly as possible. At first, I thought I could handle it. I kept telling myself that maybe this was a chance to start a new life, to finally figure myself out. But with each passing day, the sense of emptiness and guilt only grew stronger. I suddenly realized that I had lost not only Matt, but also myself. Our home, which had once been a place of comfort and safety, now felt like an empty shell, where everything reminded me of the past and what I had destroyed with my own hands. Logan, of course, tried to support me, but everything had changed. There was an awkwardness between us that grew more palpable with each day. He invited me to dinner, suggested meeting up to help distract me, but I found myself declining more and more often. What once felt natural now caused irritation and fatigue. I saw that he was trying, but deep down, I felt that we had passed the point of no return. One day, he came to my house uninvited, saying he wanted to talk. I was prepared to hear anything but the words he said. "Laura, I feel like all of this is wrong," he said, lowering his gaze. "I thought we could have something real, but now I'm not sure that we weren't just running away from ourselves." I was silent, not knowing what to say. Everything that had happened between us seemed both real and somehow illusory. Maybe it had been an escape, an attempt to fill the emptiness that had been growing inside me every day. At that moment, I realized that my relationship with Logan had also come to an end. He left, leaving behind a sense of the inevitability of this conclusion. Left alone, I sank into thoughts about what had happened. I analyzed every word, every decision, trying to understand where the point of no return had been. Was everything that seemed important to me actually just an illusion? Or had I simply failed to preserve what Matt and I had? I felt a need for change. Long walks around the city and empty conversations with friends didn't help. I needed something drastic, something that would force me to break out of this endless cycle of regret and guilt. To find myself, I decided to leave. One morning, without leaving a note or a message, I packed my things and set off on a small journey across the country. I needed time alone, far away from everything that reminded me of Matt, Logan, and our shared past. The roads, open spaces, and unfamiliar places gave me a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in a long time. I stopped in small towns, enjoying their unhurried pace and conversations with strangers. Each new day felt like a unique opportunity to live anew, to discover something new about the world and myself. I started keeping a journal, writing down my thoughts, fears, and hopes. It helped me see where I had gone wrong and realize that not all losses are irreparable. One evening, in a small seaside town, as I sat on the shore of the ocean, I felt tears streaming down my cheeks. It wasn't the usual crying of pain and despair, but cleansing tears, as if I had finally let go of everything that had been weighing me down. I allowed myself to forgive both Matt and Logan, and most importantly, myself. Acknowledging my mistakes and accepting them was the very step I hadn't been able to take all this time. I realized that I was no longer the woman who wandered in a maze of unfulfilled hopes and unresolved questions. One day, I returned to our city and felt a change in my perception. The house no longer seemed empty and hostile. Now it was a place where I could start over. I found a new job. I took a position in a small bookstore. It wasn't very prestigious, but I enjoyed being among books and helping people find stories that inspired them. I began practicing yoga again, but this time not to escape my problems, but to find the strength to face them. A few months later, I ran into Matt on the street by chance. He looked different, more confident and at peace. We talked, and I realized that things had gradually improved for him too. We didn't discuss our breakup or seek to blame anyone. We just shared a few memories and wished each other well. That conversation was a symbol for me that I had finally let go of the past and was ready to live in the present. I didn't know if I would ever find new love, but at that moment, it didn't seem like the most important thing. I had learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. My journey toward myself had turned out to be more significant and profound than I could have expected. Now, I knew that I could be happy, regardless of whether someone was beside me or not. I sat on the same beach where this story had once begun and watched the sunset. The waves crashed against the shore as they always had, but now their sound brought me not anxiety, but peace. There was no longer emptiness inside me. It had been filled with new hopes and the confidence that my life was once again in my own hands. Although the story had formally ended, life always brings new challenges and surprises. A few months after returning to my usual routine, I began to notice that the inner peace I had been striving for still wasn't complete harmony. There were moments when I felt on the edge again. Not so fragile, but still vulnerable. One day at the bookstore where I worked, a customer came in who reminded me of Logan. He was a man in his mid-30s with a casual style and expressive eyes. He walked over to the philosophy section and started browsing the books with such interest that I couldn't help but think of the conversations Logan and I used to have about the meaning of life and spiritual searching. When I approached to offer help, he looked up and smiled. "Do you know which of these books might help find answers to the questions that keep circling in my mind?" he asked. "Depends on the questions," I replied with a smile. "Sometimes the answers are nowhere near where we're looking for them." He was intrigued by my response, and our conversation unexpectedly lingered. We talked about books, about life, about travel. There was something in his voice that I immediately liked, a calmness and a light irony that allowed him to view the world without dramatics, but with deep understanding. When he suggested having coffee as he was leaving, I hesitated for a moment but then agreed, realizing that this wasn't an escape or an attempt to replace the past, but simply an interest in a person. Our meetings became regular, but I kept everything under control. I didn't allow myself to build illusions or dive into emotions that could disrupt the fragile balance again. We were more like friends, but that friendship was gradually turning into something more. One evening, after another coffee, he said, "You know, Laura, I appreciate how open you are to the world, despite past wounds. That's rare." His words made me reflect. Was I truly open, or was I just trying to appear that way? Perhaps I was learning not only how to be alone, but also how to be ready for something new, without fear or doubt. We continued seeing each other, and I realized that I was now ready to give myself a chance to experience love again. But this time, I knew that the most important thing was not to find someone to fill a void, but to learn how to live a full life on my own. Over time, my relationship with Mark grew deeper and more genuine. We continued seeing each other, but we weren't in a rush to force things. Every time I started to feel the past creeping in, trying to pull me back into its web, he would give me the space I needed to sort through my feelings. I valued this in him, his ability not to rush me, his understanding that this was more than just a new relationship for me. Together, we traveled to the places I had discovered during my solo journey. I showed him the small towns where I found comfort, the cafes where I drank my morning coffee, and the secluded beaches where I tried to let go of the past. Mark listened to my stories and shared his own, about how he, too, had to go through losses and overcome inner barriers to believe in happiness again. These trips became a small tradition for us. Every month, we would go somewhere for the weekend to explore a new place, and with each trip, I felt our relationship growing stronger. I began to see Mark not just as a friend or companion, but as someone who could be a part of my life, on the terms we were creating together without repeating the mistakes of the past.